In the modern history of the UFC, very few fighters have ever stood at the intersection of power, trust, and institutional loyalty the way Daniel Cormier did. An Olympian, a two-division UFC champion, and later one of the organization's most recognizable voices, Cormier was never just another title holder. He was something far more valuable. From Louisiana to the Olympic Games, from Strikeforce dominance to becoming both UFC light heavyweight champion and UFC heavyweight champion, his resume reads like everything the UFC wants a champion to be. But behind that flawless resume lies a contradiction that has never fully been addressed. Why did Daniel Cormier seem to survive controversies that would have damaged other fighters? Why were officiating decisions, weigh-in incidents, and disputed moments so often explained away rather than scrutinized? And why did the UFC appear unusually invested in protecting his image, even during the most heated rivalries of his career? While other champions were marketed, used, and discarded, Cormier followed a different path, one built not just on victories, but on trust. This is not a story about knockouts or belts alone. It is a story about alignment, about what happens when a fighter's values, image, and long-term usefulness align perfectly with the interests of the organization itself. As Daniel Cormier climbed the ranks, he did not just win titles, he became a stabilizing force inside a volatile system. To understand why Daniel Cormier was treated differently from almost every other champion of his era, the story must begin long before the UFC belts, before the commentary desk, and before the protection back when wrestling was not a brand, but survival. Long before championship belts and global recognition, Daniel Cormier was shaped by adversity that had nothing to do with fame. Born in 1,979 inches, Lafayette, Louisiana, he grew up in a fractured household, marked by instability and loss. Tragedy struck early and repeatedly, forging a resilience that would later define his approach to competition. In a region where opportunity was limited, wrestling became more than a sport. It became structure, discipline, and survival. From his teenage years, Cormier showed an uncommon ability to endure pressure, both physical and emotional. That resilience carried him into elite competition. Daniel Cormier emerged as one of the most accomplished American wrestlers of his generation, earning a place on Team USA and competing at the Olympic Games. Unlike many future MMA stars, he entered the sport with an already established reputation, credibility, and institutional respect. His wrestling pedigree alone positioned him as a different kind of athlete, one built on fundamentals rather than spectacle. When Cormier transitioned into mixed martial arts, he did so later than most champions, but with immediate impact. Competing in Strikeforce, he went on a dominant run that showcased his ability to adapt elite wrestling into a complete MMA game. Victories over high-level opponents quickly reframed him as a serious threat rather than a developmental prospect. By the time he entered the UFC, Daniel Cormier was not an experiment, he was an investment. Inside the UFC, his rise was swift and methodical. He defeated top contenders, demonstrated composure under pressure, and displayed a professionalism that aligned perfectly with the organization's values. His performances suggested reliability, his demeanor suggested control, and in a promotion that valued predictability as much as violence, that combination mattered. Analysts began referring to him as a safe champion, a fighter who could be trusted to deliver, represent the brand, and avoid chaos. The culmination of this rise came when Daniel Cormier captured the UFC Light Heavyweight Championship, and later the UFC Heavyweight Championship, cementing his status as a two-division champion. Few fighters in UFC history had achieved that level of success with such consistency and institutional support. But the speed and smoothness of Cormier's ascent carried an unspoken cost. As his profile grew, so did the scrutiny. And beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect rise, the foundation was already being tested by rivalries, by controversy, and by questions that would soon define how his career was truly remembered. As Daniel Cormier solidified his position at the top of the UFC, controversy followed, but in a form that felt fundamentally different from the scandals that damaged other fighters. His career was not defined by legal trouble or suspensions, but by a pattern of disputed moments that were repeatedly explained, contextualized, or quietly neutralized. The most defining of these controversies centered on a single name, Jon Jones. Their rivalry was not just personal, it became structural. Again and again, Cormier found himself on the losing end of outcomes that shaped public perception. Yet the aftermath rarely weakened his standing within the organization. When Jon Jones defeated Cormier in their first title fight, the loss was framed as honorable rather than damaging. When the rematch ended in a knockout, later overturned due to Jones's testing violation, the narrative shifted again. Daniel Cormier regained the UFC light heavyweight championship without stepping into the cage, a moment that would have cast doubt over most champions. Instead, it reinforced his image as the division's stabilizing figure. The belt returned to him not because of spectacle, but because the system needed continuity. Other controversies followed. The weigh-in towel incident, in which questions were raised about whether Cormier properly made weight, sparked brief outrage before being absorbed into official explanations. Analysts debated, fans argued, but consequences never arrived. In the UFC's ecosystem, these moments were treated as anomalies rather than failures. For critics, this suggested favoritism. For supporters, it confirmed trust. The pattern continued during Cormier's time at heavyweight, particularly in his trilogy with Stipe Miocic. Moments involving eye pokes, referee decisions, and fight-ending sequences became focal points of debate. In another context, these incidents might have overshadowed achievements. In Cormier's case, they were acknowledged, but rarely escalated. The organization emphasized sportsmanship, professionalism, and respect, softening narratives that might otherwise have turned hostile. What made these controversies so impactful was not their severity, but their outcome. Each incident tested how much damage Daniel Cormier's image could absorb, and each time it held. Not because fans ignored the issues, but because the UFC framed them in a way that preserved his value. This was not accidental. Cormier represented reliability in an era defined by volatility. Losing him to scandal would have cost the organization far more than defending him ever did. Yet this protection came with a price. To many observers, it blurred the line between fairness and convenience. Was Daniel Cormier treated differently because he was respected or because he was useful? The answer was never stated openly, but the pattern was unmistakable. Where others were questioned, Cormier was contextualized. Where others were punished, he was preserved. And beneath every controversy lay a deeper truth. These moments were not just about rules or rivalries, they were about leverage. Because behind the scenes, Daniel Cormier had already become something more than a fighter. He had become an asset whose value extended beyond wins and losses. And that is where the story turns next. Because to understand why controversy never truly derailed Daniel Cormier, one must follow the trail that matters most in the UFC money and power. In the UFC, championships may create headlines, but money determines who holds real influence. This is where Daniel Cormier's career takes on a different meaning. While he was never marketed as a crossover megastar in the style of Conor McGregor, Cormier generated something the UFC valued just as highly: predictable, long-term stability. His fight purses, pay-per-view shares, and consistent placement in high-profile title bouts positioned him as a reliable financial asset rather than a volatile gamble. As a two-division champion, Daniel Cormier headlined major events across light heavyweight and heavyweight, anchoring cards that required credibility more than chaos. Even when his PPV numbers did not break records, they rarely collapsed. For the UFC, this mattered. Cormier could be trusted to sell events based on legitimacy, rivalry, and competitive stakes, not manufactured drama. That reliability translated into leverage. He was not easily replaced, because he did not rely on hype cycles that faded quickly. But Cormier's value extended far beyond what happened inside the cage. From an organizational perspective, he fit a rare profile: elite athlete, media-friendly communicator, and institutionally aligned personality. The UFC did not just see him as a fighter earning purses, they saw him as a long-term investment. Commentary potential, analyst credibility, public speaking, and brand safety all factored into how he was valued. In short, Daniel Cormier was being priced not only for his present, but for his future. This dual valuation changed the power dynamic. Fighters who are seen as temporary attractions can be pressured, stalled, or discarded. Fighters viewed as future pillars cannot. Every controversy involving Cormier was weighed against what he represented beyond the octagon. Suspending, sidelining, or publicly undermining him would have weakened more than a title picture. It would have damaged a carefully built institutional asset. Financially, this created a form of insulation. Daniel Cormier did not need to chase extreme behavior to remain relevant, nor did he need to threaten the organization to maintain leverage. His power came from alignment. He reinforced the UFC's image as a professional, respectable sports organization rather than a spectacle-driven circus. That alignment made him useful in rooms. Fighters never see broadcast meetings, sponsor negotiations, and public-facing initiatives. The result was a quiet but undeniable shift. Where other champions were evaluated fight by fight, Cormier was evaluated system-wide. His presence reduced risk. His voice carried authority. His cooperation preserved order. And in a business that thrives on control, those qualities were priceless. This is why the controversies discussed earlier never fully destabilized his career. The cost of losing Daniel Cormier was never measured in PPV losses alone. It was measured in influence, continuity, and institutional trust. And that trust followed him wherever he went, even beyond the cage. Because the true reach of Daniel Cormier's power cannot be understood by contracts or paydays alone. It must be examined through the life he built outside competition, and how that life made him indispensable to the UFC's future. Away from the spotlight of championship fights, Daniel Cormier built a life that mirrored exactly what the UFC wanted the public to see. He presented himself not as a rebel or an unpredictable star, but as a family man, a mentor, and a leader within the sport. While many champions struggled with excess, volatility, or image crises, Cormier leaned into stability. His role as a husband, father, and coach was not hidden. It was emphasized, repeated, and carefully reinforced through interviews, features, and media appearances. This lifestyle mattered more than it appeared. In an organization constantly battling criticism over fighter safety, compensation, and ethics, Daniel Cormier became a counterweight. He spoke calmly. He explained the sport clearly. He defended the UFC publicly, even during moments when other fighters expressed resentment or frustration. Over time, he evolved into more than a competitor. He became a trusted voice, someone sponsors could rely on, someone media outlets felt comfortable amplifying, someone the UFC could put in front of cameras without fear of damage control. Yet this polished image also created a quiet contradiction. While Cormier was celebrated as the good guy, he was still a fierce competitor operating in a ruthless system. Losses hurt deeply, especially those against Jon Jones, and moments of emotional vulnerability occasionally broke through the composed exterior. Interviews revealed frustration, insecurity, and a lingering sense of being second best in the eyes of history. These cracks did not weaken his image, but they humanized it, making him even more relatable to audiences the UFC wanted to retain. After fights, Cormier did not disappear. He transitioned seamlessly into commentary, analysis, and mentorship roles. This visibility blurred the line between active fighter and organizational representative. Few champions in UFC history managed this balance so effectively while still competing at the highest level. It reinforced a crucial message. Daniel Cormier was not just passing through the system, he belonged to it. This proximity to the organization had consequences. Critics argued that his closeness to the UFC compromised neutrality, particularly once he became a commentator while still involved in rivalries. Supporters countered that his insight elevated the sport. Both interpretations missed the deeper truth. Cormier's lifestyle made him indispensable. It reduced risk. It projected maturity. It reassured audiences that the UFC could produce champions who thrived beyond violence. And that is where his life outside the cage connected directly to the controversies discussed earlier. When disputes arose, Daniel Cormier had something few others possessed: institutional goodwill. His image absorbed shock. His reputation softened criticism. His role outside competition created a buffer that protected him inside it. This was not accidental. It was the result of years of alignment between fighter and organization. Daniel Cormier lived the kind of life the UFC wanted its champions to represent, and in return, the UFC treated him as more than just another athlete. But this raises the most important question of all. If Cormier's value extended far beyond fighting, then what would the UFC truly lose if he walked away? And more importantly, could they ever afford to let him go? For the UFC, losing Daniel Cormier was never a simple risk. It was a structural threat. Unlike champions whose value ended when the belt changed hands, Cormier occupied a rare position where competitive relevance, institutional trust, and future utility overlapped. He was not just a draw on fight night, he was a stabilizer in an organization built on volatility. In divisions often defined by chaos, Cormier delivered predictability, something far more valuable than spectacle when the stakes are high. The first reason is PPV stability. While Daniel Cormier was not the loudest promoter, his fights reliably anchored major events. Fans trusted the product when his name was on top of a card. Whether facing Anthony Johnson, John Jones, or Stipe Miocic, Cormier's bouts carried legitimacy that reassured buyers. That legitimacy protected the UFC from the financial whiplash caused by short reigns, last-minute cancellations, or unreliable stars. He was a safe investment in an unsafe sport. The second reason is institutional loyalty. Daniel Cormier consistently defended the UFC publicly, explained its decisions, and acted as a bridge between fighters and management. He did not posture as an outsider or challenge the organization's authority. Instead, he reinforced it. That loyalty translated into trust, something the UFC does not grant easily. In return, Cormier received a level of protection and continuity that other champions never experienced. This was not favoritism, it was strategy. The third factor is post-career value. Long before retirement, Daniel Cormier was already being positioned as a permanent presence. His transition into commentary, analysis, and mentorship was seamless, proving that his usefulness extended far beyond competition. The UFC rarely builds around fighters who will disappear after their final bout. Cormier was different. He was being integrated into the brand's future. Losing him would have meant losing not just a champion, but a voice the organization relied on to shape narratives. There is also the matter of symbolism. Daniel Cormier represented an ideal outcome for the UFC's talent pipeline. An elite athlete who matured into a responsible spokesperson without burning bridges. In a sport often criticized for excess and instability, he was proof that champions could be controlled, trusted, and retained. That symbolism mattered to sponsors, broadcasters, and regulators alike. This explains why the UFC's relationship with Cormier always felt insulated. When controversies arose, they were managed. When disputes appeared, they were softened. The cost of losing him was simply too high. Not because he was unbeatable, but because he was irreplaceable in ways that rankings cannot measure. And that leads to the defining question of his career. Was Daniel Cormier protected because he was great, or because he was essential to how the UFC wanted to be seen? When the career of Daniel Cormier is viewed in full, it becomes clear that his legacy cannot be measured by belts alone. Yes, he was an Olympian, a two-division UFC champion, and one of the most technically accomplished wrestlers to ever enter the octagon. But his true impact lies deeper at the intersection of competition, control, and institutional power. Cormier was not just a champion within the system. He became part of the system itself. History will likely remember Daniel Cormier as a paradox, a fighter defined by resilience and professionalism, yet forever compared to rivals whose shadows shaped public perception. A champion praised for integrity, yet surrounded by controversies that never fully attached to him. A competitor who lost some of his biggest battles, but won something far more enduring: trust. That trust changed everything. It softened defeats. It contextualized disputes. It opened doors that remained closed to most fighters after retirement. While others faded, Cormier transitioned seamlessly into the voice of the sport, explaining it, defending it, and shaping how audiences understand it. His journey revealed an uncomfortable truth about the UFC. Greatness is important, but usefulness is decisive. So the final question is not whether Daniel Cormier was one of the best fighters of his era, The question is far more revealing. Who benefited most from Daniel Cormier's career? The fans who admired him? The organization that relied on him? Or Cormier himself, who learned how power truly works inside the UFC? The story of Daniel Cormier is not just about victory and defeat, it is about alignment. And in a sport where most fighters are eventually discarded, alignment may be the rarest championship of all.